welcome everybody to our panel on systemic racism. Just so you've probably noted that all audio is will be muted just to ensure the best sound quality. But please post any questions that you have in the chat column. There will be a panel discussion or Q&A after each speaker. So there'll be 2 segments of Q&A. So please post them in chat, and Anne, my partner here, will be monitoring the chat. And just so you know too, that the session is being recorded and it will be shared on our website, but only for members only. Okay, now sorry? I thought I heard them. Okay, so I will introduce Patricia now, our moderator. Patricia is currently a member of the board of the BC Forum and has been a member of IWF since 1997, first with the Hong Kong Forum, and after returning to Canada, the BC Forum. Former broadcast journalist, she was a correspondent for CBC The National and later CNN International, where she anchored a daily evening newscast and a weekly magazine show, both broadcast more than 120 countries. Her non-journalism career includes stints as president, Asia of the Global Blindness Prevention Organization, Orbis, and in Vancouver as executive director of West Coast Environmental Law. Patricia's most recent occupation has been as an entrepreneur, making micro-documentaries for values-driven organizations and individuals. COVID has introduced Patricia to the joys of semi-retirement, like a few of us, I'm sure. Her deepest desire is to have a carefree evening of laughter, good wine, and good friends at a great restaurant, or on Zoom with your other colleagues. So I'll turn it over to you, Patricia.
Oh, well, thank you, Evie. So today we're exploring, as Evie said, and as you all know, the topic of systemic racism in Canada. Something that many Canadians have long said does not exist in this country. We're not like the United States, we like to say. We're a country built on the principles of multiculturalism, where everyone is equal to everyone else. We've made excuses when asked about our treatment of our Indigenous people, saying, well, that's a long and very different story, but we're doing something about it. But the cracks have been widening, and the horrific murder of George Floyd last year by a white police officer in Minnesota has triggered the same kind of attention, introspection, and accusations here in this country as it has south of the border and elsewhere. Our 2 accomplished speakers, both lifelong British Columbians, know this all too well. Their calendars have been flooded with speaking engagements, locally, but also nationally and internationally in the past few months. So we're very fortunate to have them with us today. Thank you for coming, Lorna and Valerie. As Evie mentioned, because there's so much to cover, today's discussion will be in 2 parts with a Q&A after each one. In the first part, Lorna and Valerie will talk about their personal lives, what it was like growing up in British Columbia, their work, and their lived experiences with racism. In the second part, we'll address the wider themes of racial profiling, unconscious bias, and what needs to change, how we can be better allies. So let's begin by introducing you to our 2 guests. Valerie Jerome is a Canadian Olympian, educator, and former political candidate who has built a legacy of contribution to Black Canadian studies, environmental policies, and together with her brother, famed track and field star Harry Jerome, to Canadian athletics. Born in Winnipeg, but raised in North Vancouver, Valerie shot to fame at the age of just 15 in the 1959 Canadian Championships, winning gold in 3 events, the 60-meter, the 80-meter, and the 4x100-meter relay events. She went on to compete in the Pan American Games and the 1960 Summer Olympics alongside her brother, Harry. Over the next 35 years, she continued to give back to the athletic community as a track and field official, as a chief judge at the 1976 Montreal Olympics, and officiating at numerous Olympics, World Championships, and Commonwealth Games, capping off that brilliant career as a torchbearer in Vancouver's own 2010 Winter Olympics. Together with Harry, Valerie founded the Jerome Outreach Society that works to hire coaches to coach at low-income schools in Vancouver at no cost to the schools. Since 2007, more than 2,000 children have benefited from this program. As a political candidate for the Green Party between 1985 and 2000, Valerie was championing environmental issues long before sustainability was a buzzword. Her son, Stuart Parker, following in her footsteps, actually becoming leader of the Green Party of BC in 1993. Arguably, though, Valerie's greatest legacy has been as a teacher. A graduate of UBC's Education Studies, Valerie taught in Vancouver schools for 35 years, where she fought to promote, Where she fought to promote understanding and racial equity. So thank you very much, Valerie, for joining us. Dr. Lorna Williams, our other speaker, was born in Mount Currie, BC, a member of the Lil'wat Nation. As a child, she was sent to Indian day school and then to residential school, where she was stripped of her language. Yet she persevered, drawing strength and inspiration once back in her community. She trained at BCIT to become a nurse like her mother, then found her true calling in education. She obtained her Master's of Education at Simon Fraser University and became the First Nation specialist to the Vancouver School Board, providing educational opportunities to urban Native youth in the Vancouver area. Lorna's legacy has been one of promoting, restoring, and saving Indigenous knowledge and language. She worked to get the First Nations involvement in the Canadian Charter. She initiated and led the development of bachelor's and master's degree in Indigenous language revitalization and a master's in counseling in Indigenous communities. She also initiated, designed, and implemented a mandatory course in Indigenous education for all teacher education students, leading to the requirement that all teacher education programs in BC include an Indigenous education course. Lorna is currently Professor Emerita of Indigenous Education Curriculum and Instruction at the University of Victoria and Research Chair in Education in Linguistics. A recipient of the Order of Canada, Lorna is an elder on the Ministers' Council on Indigenous Women. Welcome and thank you, Laura. So I'd like to start with your early lives. And Valerie, first question to you. You and your brother Harry were exceptional youngsters, obviously, becoming track stars at a very early age. How did that come about? Was it your parents? Were they athletic?
Well, actually, our grandfather had run in the 1912 Olympics. My mother's father, Army Howard, he was Canada's 100-meter champion, 200-meter champion from 1909 until the outbreak of World War I. But none of that came through our family. That man's name was never uttered in my home. I knew absolutely nothing about him. And just in the last few years, since he's been honored by the Canadian Army or military, they did a special presentation on him. He was Canada's first Black Olympian. So I began to find out some information about him, and the Manitoba Sport Hall of Fame has featured him. So I knew very little about him, and so his legacy was not something we were aware of, although we certainly had his genes. We lived in North Vancouver, and one of the reasons we didn't know anything at all about our grandfather is because racism really split up our family. My grandmother, who had come from England after World War I, she had met my grandfather in Europe, and she was an English woman. She came to Canada and married my grandfather. They had 3 daughters together, and when they subsequently divorced and my grandmother remarried, she remarried a white man who did not want anything to do with these girls who were half black. And so my mother was 13. She was put out to work in somebody's home. This is in Manitoba. And my second aunt was sent to a reform school at age 11. And my other aunt was taken in by her grade 4 teacher. So my mother didn't know anything about her father after about the age of 11. He was away a lot working on the trains. That's what our prime minister had deemed any blacks coming into Canada or to work in the railway system. So my mother was very ashamed of her blackness, deeply ashamed. And ironically, she ended up marrying a black man. And so she produced, you know, more black people, and she wasn't really fond of us, and she never mentioned her father. And so we didn't really know much about him. But my older brother was very, very athletic and very interested in continual physical activity, mainly as a way of staying out of the house and staying away from being under our mother's feet. And so he got involved in a lot of sports. And he ended up in track and field, even though he had been an excellent baseball player. He really needed an individual sport, because sometimes on his baseball team, not only were the people in the stands calling him a nigger, but also people on his own team who weren't necessarily the most progressive people in North Vancouver. So his dear friend, who was the coach of his baseball team, Harry had been the star of the team, pitching no-hitters and sprinting to the bases and all that kind of stuff. And Fen Burdett said, you know, Harry, you need to find an individual sport, because this other stuff really gets to you. It's time to move on. So when he joined a track club, he wanted me too, as well, to get out of the house and have some physical activity. So yeah, I was 14. He was, I guess, 17. We joined a track club, and we were very fortunate. We did well, and yeah, that's how we started. But track and field wouldn't have been his first choice. He would have loved to have been a baseball player, but yeah, he didn't do too badly as a runner. Yeah.
Well, that's a tragic start, but you both became such decorated athletes. How did it feel to be a gold medal winner 3 times over at the age of 15?
And yes, I'll just correct those events. That was the women's 60, the 100 meters, and the long jump, actually. It was a big surprise to me. I had no idea. We ran in the BC championships here, and, you know, it was okay. We were, you know, we did okay. But going to the national championships, and of course, in those days, Canada's black population was not seen at all. Those Canadian championships in 1959, unlike our Canadian championships of today, everybody at the meet was white. You know, in every event. It's one of our friends from North Vancouver who was black, who had recently moved to North Vancouver. There were 3 black people at that meet. Now, when you look at the Canadian championships and you look at the final, the men's 100 meters, and that reflects our immigration policy. From 1909 until 1960, we let 100 black people into this country per year. And the black population went from 86,000 at the time of Confederation to 18,000 by 1956. So Mr. Laurier, who also wanted any blacks who came into the country to work as porters, that really held for a very long time through a lot of prime ministers. So yeah, the Canadian championships in track and field were, well, actually the Olympics themselves were sort of a white old boys club. But actually the 1960 Olympics actually included a lot of countries that hadn't been in the Olympics before. So yeah, browned up the world.
Well, I mean, what a tragic beginning, but how did it feel standing there on the podium?
Well, I was stunned. I was stunned. I was elated, and I was very happy that Harry won, but I don't think I even understood the significance. I hadn't even heard of the Pan American Games, and yet we were picked for the team, and off we went to Chicago later that summer. It was thrilling, but you know, your self-image is not built on one race. Your self-image, or one track meet, your self-image has been built growing up in a community where we were the only black people, stoned off the school grounds the first day we went to school in 1951, after moving here from Winnipeg. People who never spoke to us on that street, even when we had a house fire and we're standing out in the middle of the street at 2 a.m., listening to the fire engines approaching, and nobody on that street did anything other than raise their blinds, look out, see my pregnant mother with 4 other kids waiting for the fire engines. They didn't offer us a spot on their floor or their Chesterfield. We went to the Salvation Army Hall at 2:30 in the morning to sleep. So yes, it was wonderful to get those accolades and the acclaim and attract me, but it really doesn't. Your overall experience, and as I said, my mother wasn't happy about being Black. It takes a while. It's more than one summer that changes, you know, how you feel about yourself, or whether you're even allowed to celebrate who you are, you know, whether it's okay, you know, do people think I'm weird, that I might think I'm good? So you're not even happy to sort of celebrate that, you know. They thought my brother was cocky. They thought that we were whatever. We were terrified people, scared. We kept our mouths shut. You just, you know, you don't want to upset anybody. So we didn't always celebrate. We celebrated at track practices. We were in a wonderful track club. That was really our home, our family, these wonderful people who were like us, you know, coming from homes that maybe weren't that happy. We enjoyed each other. The only way we were measured was by the stopwatch and the measuring tape. It wasn't by the color of our skin. And we could celebrate then and feel a little proud of ourselves, but it wasn't something I ever grew up with feeling, oh, wasn't I great, or what didn't I do well? I haven't even got there yet, and I'm 77 years old, you know, so.
You know, for those who haven't heard the story, Valerie, would you tell the story about your first day of school in North Vancouver?
So we arrived in Vancouver in late August, and bought this house in North Vancouver. We were living in a rooming house for a few weeks in Vancouver, and there had been a petition to keep us from purchasing that house. And the reason these people had taken a petition to City Hall was because most properties in all of Greater Vancouver had covenants on them saying you won't sell to an Asian, you won't sell to Blacks, you won't sell to Jews. And so here was a Lower Lonsdale community in North Vancouver, and they didn't have these covenants. And so they went to City Hall to see if they could block us moving in. Well, you know, I wasn't even sort of aware of all of that. My parents had to deal with that. So we moved on the street. Nobody spoke to us. One family did, and I'll refer to that family probably too many times today once we get going. But anyway, our first day of school, that Tuesday morning after Labor Day, my older brother Harry, my older sister Carolyn. Harry was going into grade 5, Carolyn was going into grade 4, I was going into grade 2, and my younger brother, who was mentally handicapped, was going into grade 1. And school was right across 8th Street from our home. We had been playing on the school grounds, you know, for the week leading up to school once we'd moved in. And the kids were ready for us. They had their piles of stones, hundreds of kids with all these stones, and we didn't even get halfway across the street. I mean, I remember after I turned that I got hit in the back of my head and it was bleeding, but they pelted our backs, our legs, and our fence wasn't high enough, so the rocks, you know, continued to rain down on us. And we stayed there at home for 2 days. My dad was on a railway trip. Orders were gone, you know, most of the time. And our mother didn't have any great sense of herself. She had already been rejected by her own mother for being part Black. She didn't believe in us. She wasn't a big fan of education. She didn't have much herself. And so she just let us play in the backyard. And my dad came home a couple of days later and took us across the street, and all these kids were waiting for us. They didn't have the rocks in their hands, but they were kicking up the dirt and the rocks and calling us niggers, Blackie, Aunt Jemima babies, you know, curse words that would curl your hair. And then my dad left us on the school ground, surrounded by these hundreds of kids, and he went into the school to speak to Mr. Bullman, the principal. He was in there for quite a while. I was absolutely terrified. We didn't bring our younger brother with us at that point. He was very upset by the rock incident 2 days previously. Anyway, Mr. Bullman eventually came out onto the grounds with a megaphone and told these children that they were going to have to, you know, shape up, that we were entitled to go to school there. And and one little girl, this is the only family on our block that had not signed the petition. 7-year-old Annabelle, red hair, freckles, thick glasses. She didn't stand with the rest of the kids. She left that group, that mob, this vile mob with the filthiest mouths you could imagine, and came and stood beside us. And every school talk that I have given since then, as I say to these students at every school, dare to be an Annabelle. And I say it to adults too. The courage of a child to make that decision, to see that the mob is not the place to be, you know, to dare to stand with people and recognize the dignity of others. Anyway, I never enjoyed going to Ridgeway School. I used to throw up almost every day. I hated eating the cold porridge, but it was a way of delaying having to cross the grounds. I'd wait until after the bell had gone, and then I'd, you know, my younger brother was strapped because he was mentally handicapped, but he was grade 1, this cute little kid with these big loose curls. And he kept saying that, well, it's because I can't learn, you know, I mean, anyway, North Van eventually did treat us quite well, but it took quite a while to get there. We had to run to prove our worth to get the respect that we should have had when we first got there.
Wow. Wow. Lorna, you were born in Mount Currie. What was life like at that time for a child of the Lillooet Nation community?
Before we begin, I would like to introduce myself in my way.
Okay, please do.
Wanosa and Shquachicha. Lillooet Ula Shwaash and Shnuknuk. Tawta Amash Lakan and Jauna Kamukhmin Twal Shnulap. الجونة تتميخشا إلى قواننا إسقايمالت Huxanich. I introduce myself in this way to you and to the ancestors on whose land I am living in Victoria, the Lakwanan speaking people and the Huxanich. And it's our way of acknowledging that we're not alone and that we're all connected to our ancestors, and each of you is connected to the ancestors on the lands on which you reside. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that.
Thank you for that.
Yes, I grew up in Mount Currie. We call it Lillooet Ul. When I was born, we were still quite an intact community, you know, pretty much everybody, Lillooet was Uqalmiuch was our language, although some people spoke some English and French and other languages. And so, I was fortunate, and this is what I tell people, that and I'm in that age group now where we were able to experience a real traditional life. And so, for example, we still had in the wintertime, we still had gatherings in people's, you know, in each other's homes, where people told stories and sang our songs and just visited and had that sense of real strong community. And so having that experience, I think, has been something that's been so important to me. And you know, and having to cope with the experiences of growing up in this country, having that strong, sound beginning, I think is a real blessing.
Solid foundation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then you were sent to, well, when you started school, it was Indian Day School. Is that the same as residential school, but not sleeping over, or what was that?
Yeah, Indian Day Schools were were built on larger reserves across the country. And another name for them was industrial schools. It was to prepare, to try to prepare Indigenous people to go into industry, into labor jobs. And so it was a federal school because education for Indians is a federal responsibility, not a provincial one. And so we were not able to go to provincial schools. And so I started then in the Indian day school and in grade 1, and attended, excited because my brothers had been and told me about it, and I started to learn some English, and then in grade 2 I was sent to residential school in Williams Lake in St. Joseph's Mission. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And how many years were you there?
I was there for 3 years, and ended up back home because I broke my foot and it wasn't set, it wasn't taken care of, and then I developed hepatitis, and so I was very, very ill, and so my mom and a nurse who had come over and married one of the farmers from Scotland. They were friends. They decided that I wasn't going back, and so they said, "We'll go to jail if but we're not sending her back." So that's how I ended up not going, being able to stay home.
What was the impact that residential school had on you those 3 years?
Well, confusion probably, because I didn't understand what was happening. I didn't understand why, why I was sent there, and because we weren't able to, the policy was to send First Nations children to different residential schools, and so that we wouldn't be able to communicate.
Oh.
So I had an older sister, and I went to Williams Lake, and my other sisters were sent to Mission and so and then another one was sent to Kamloops, and so they divided the families, they divided the community. So it was very planned and organized, so that people wouldn't be able to communicate. And so, because of the punishment if we spoke our language, and because of I think just the trauma of being separated from my family at such a young age, I lost and then the teachers, the nuns in the residential school where I was, were mostly French speaking. And so they couldn't really speak to us anyway, even in English. And so there was just so much confusion, with all the different languages that really people couldn't quite use. So I ended up back home not having a language. I wasn't able to communicate, and that was really difficult. And it was difficult. It was challenging. It was isolating, and further, I would say further confusion. But because I had hepatitis and other conditions, I was put into a hospital nearby and in Squamish, and I was there for 4 months, and I regained the English that I'd learned and learned more English. And then when I went back home, I lived in the part of my village that was the oldest part. It was the first stationary community that for our people, and it was built like in the 1860s, and so it was very old, and all the people who lived around me, were old people who'd never, and many of them, most of them, the majority of them had never been to school. And so they were still really healthy and intact, and thinking, going back, because I was trying to think of why I was able to overcome, that experience. And what I learned, I think, was that they treated me the way at that time traditionally what treated children, which was so respectful and whole and really nourishing and stabilizing, and so they never explained to me what they were doing, but they realized what had happened with my language, and so they began to different ways of helping me to regain my ability to speak, and not just the verbal part of it, but the internal drive to be able to communicate again. And so at a very young age, then I became bilingual. And so that's the time I spent in this hospital learning English. And then when I went home, I regained my language. I was able to function in 2 languages. And so I became an interpreter for many of the old people. So when they'd have to go to the store, and they needed English, they'd drag me along, or if they had to go to see the doctor or the Indian agent. And at the time, I didn't know that's what I was doing. But and so I think my work now in languages really had its beginning in those years. Mm-hmm.
But then you decided, when you became older, you decided to study nursing.
Yes, my mom was the healer in our community. Like before the doctor, we had a doctor. She's the one who did surgeries. She looked after people, and she really knew all the medicinal plants, and so the way that people function in our villages in traditional times is that from a very young age, people look to see what your gifts are, what your interests are, and they foster those in you. And so healing, I think, was similar to like my mom was what they saw in me. So I used to go with her when she would go and do her healing work, and they were teaching me about the plants and the medicines. And so I thought, well, I'll go into nursing, but I wasn't very good in math, and that's not good. But when I began my practical work in a hospital in Burnaby, I realized that I wouldn't be able to function in a hospital because at that time the hierarchy in the medical system was really, really strong, and the difference between men and women was just I knew I wouldn't be able to function.
And being First Nations, was that a factor?
It was a big factor, and but it's always a factor. So I just, like it's something that that I've had, learned to live with, but it's a factor, but you just can do what you need to do.
So why did you decide to switch to education?
I left nursing and I went back home and I took a year. I spent a year with an organization called Canada World Youth, and that some of you might have heard of. And it was its first year, and I was a group leader. I became a group leader for that in that organization, and was responsible for 10 Canadian youth. And I brought them to Malaysia. That's where we were sent. And this is an important part of, I think, my history. And I spent 6 months in Malaysia, going to different states. And it was there that I saw the indigenous people on the peninsula of Malaysia. We had been told that they no longer existed. And we ended up in a place at a camp where they were at the edge of the camp. And anyway, I met them, and I saw that what I saw was what my grandparents must have experienced. Total removal from the rest of society. And I found out that they, for example, that they had their own schools that they were being sent to, their own hospitals, and it was the same as us here. And then I went to Sarawak and spent 6 weeks in Sarawak, in going to several lawn houses with the Iban people. And I saw the different stages of their assimilation. And it was there that I learned about and really witnessed what I had lived, what my parents had lived, what my grandparents had lived. And so I just really, I'm so grateful that, that I had that experience, because I was able to see colonialism and imperialism as a witness, and so you can see things in that sense that you might not, that, living it, sometimes you can't see it. The other piece of it was that there were Canada World Youth was for Canadians across the country. And so there were people from the French-speaking communities in Ontario and in Quebec, in Manitoba, and New Brunswick. And there was one Black person, a young man, and he ended up in my group. There was a Chinese woman from Vancouver who was also a group leader. And, and I think that was the three of us. We were the only ones who were not white. And so it was very important in that experience to see Canada and the makeup of Canada and what Canada does to its people. And so so when I came back home, I ended up back in Mount Currie. And it was at the time when band controlled schools began. And so, and I like to tell this story. Valerie told the story about Annabelle. Well, there was a decision in 1947, the year that I was born. There was a paper that was discussed in the joint houses of Parliament called Liquidating Canada's Indians in 25 Years. Can you imagine? Liquidating Canada's Indians in 25 years. And so what that paper was proposing was to put First Nation, to put Indigenous peoples into public school. So remember I told you that we weren't allowed in public school. And so they thought that sending us to residential school and keeping us in Indian day schools had not wiped out our language. We were, Indians were still speaking their language and still practicing our cultural ways. And so they thought the only way that they can rid us of those was to send us to public school. And so that was in 1947. It took until 1967 to open public schools. And so our children, so they began to close down the Indian day schools. And in about 1969, there was a group of 11 and 12-year-olds, and their classroom was going to be closed down, and they were supposed to be bused to the neighboring white community, to the public school. And they, as a group, they said, "We're not going." They told their parents, "We're not going. If you want us to get an education," they said, then you have to do something. But we're not getting on that bus." And so their parents had to do something. And that's how our school in Mount Currie began. And so the parents got a teacher, couldn't pay him, but he came with his family, and my mom put them up in her house, and they taught this group of kids. And so that's how our school began. And then when I came home, the band-controlled schools were started because of a paper called Indian Education, and so it was a new thing, and so we decided to take over our school, and of course we needed teachers. And even though I at that time didn't have a teacher education certificate, I had, university, some university, and so they asked me if I would teach. And so that's how I began my teaching career. And then in 1973, we started a teacher education program in partnership with Simon Fraser University. Simon Fraser was the only university that would support us. But it's because of a woman named Jewison.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. She was the president up at SFU.
Yes.
Yes.
And in her inaugural speech, she said that she wanted to support Native education. And so we went to her and said, well, here's an opportunity. And we just started the teacher education program with their support in Mount Currie. And we had said to them that we wanted to have a teacher education program where we weren't going to colonize our own people. And, because teacher education is very colonizing.
Yeah.
And so they supported us. There were enough people with revolutionary spirits there, that knew what we were talking about and supported us. And so that's how I got my start in education. And you know, Mount Currie, you know, in those early years, you know, one of the things that I remember, we started, you know, we started our high school, and we had, I think, 35 students in September. By December, we had 90 students, you know, because there were so many of our people who wanted an education, and but you know, couldn't get an education. And so you know, so many of the ideas that I've put into place ever since, you know, were really born during those years. And I became the director of our curriculum and culture, and so we started right away working on our language. And developing curriculum materials and ways of teaching our language, not just to people in school, but, you know, throughout the community.
I can see Valerie nodding and smiling along with what you're saying.
I love it. I love this story. It's wonderful.
Now, Valerie, what about you? I mean, here you were a professional, well, not professional, but you were an award-winning athlete traveling all over the world. Why did you decide to study education and become a teacher?
Well, I have to say, I really appreciated the few good teachers I had who were not racist, who didn't look for an opportunity to have me strapped or sent out of the room, who actually enjoyed teaching me. And I was very fortunate. My first year at Ridgeway School in North Vancouver, I had a wonderful grade 2 teacher. She was just terrific. And I had a couple more by the time I got to the end of high school. And I realized that teachers can make such a big difference in people's lives. And I have tried throughout my career to love every one of my students, even the ones who were absolute pains in the butt. You know, I really felt we owed it to them to help them. I guess the old-fashioned word would be self-actualize, but like themselves and realize their talents and become what their potential, you know, would allow them to do. And you know, these 3 or 4 teachers I had really made a difference in my life. And so I had at one point wanted to be a nurse, but by the time I got to grade 10, I realized I couldn't stand the sight of blood, and wasn't going to be somebody who could help somebody who was being sick. So, and my dad had always very much wanted me to be a teacher. That was a big thing for him. So, and seeing these wonderful teachers, and I think teachers who are good teachers should know they've done a good job and they've saved somebody, literally saved people.
Was it difficult as a Black woman going through the educational program?
Well, you know, you're pretty inured to it by the time you get through public school. You already know you're second class or third. But despite any athletics, it did whitewash us a little bit. You know, I actually got elected to Students' Council when I was in grade 12 at North Van High. So in some instances, you are sort of buoyed a bit. But, you know, at university, you know, some of the people I had were just shocking. You know, they thought it was okay for students to write the word, you know, nigger into their essays, and they would talk about this as though, you know, this was a perfectly good topic of discussion. I remember when I went teaching after only 2 years of university because I had left home very early and I needed to get busy and support myself. And I had 2 interviews and I went to the one in North Vancouver. Well, what a dumb idea to even apply there. But anyway, they gave me an interview and I went, and this man, Mr. Frompson, who was head of personnel, he just held onto the doorknob as I came in. He didn't say sit down or anything. He just looked me straight in the face and said, well, we don't hire, you know, people who graduated from school here in North Vancouver. Now, I could have said, well, my friend Sharon Mussel got hired yesterday by you, and she went to school here. But I didn't say that. He just made me so uncomfortable. He didn't even want me to sit down, so I left. It was probably less than 1 minute I was in the room. And fortunately, the next day I went for an interview in Vancouver, and Mr. Ed Irwin was a wonderful man. I was so relieved. He said, sit down, and within 10 minutes, he was saying to me, we look forward to having you in the system. I got in the door, but within a year, I quit. I loved my students, but I had a principal who, before we went on any field trips, would come into my room and say, give me that little darky over there. And he'd want a strap, either the little South Asian girl or a black girl, or he wanted to, you know, I don't want kids misbehaving and embarrassing our school when they're out. Mr. Harper, these children will not misbehave. Well, give me that little darky. I got to strap somebody. They need to know what'll happen if they misbehave. So that kind of thing. Plus, you know, he was just so racist. The word nigger fell out of his mouth more often than the word the. He was appalling. So I made it through the year because I was determined to support all of those kids. And then I went back to university, which I needed to do anyway. I just had to get out. And going back, I found a few more, I would say, racist teachers at university. But anyway, I just had to endure. And then, of course, there were lots of schools, you know, you show up and the principal might not be happy to see you, but then you've got parents who don't want their kids in a black woman's class. And, you know, the first day of school, you've got kids wanting to transfer out of your class. Why? Well, give me a reason. You know, obviously it was my color. So I hadn't done anything. I hadn't said anything inappropriate. The kids, for the most part, all of my career, they loved me. I'm still hearing from hundreds of kids per month. And so I found the education system quite shocking. And, you know, you just had to sort of put your head down, and after staying a certain amount of time at some schools, you knew it was time to go. And my very last years of teaching, the second to last principal I had, I mean, he was awful. We had some immigrants from Haiti, and, you know, poor Vanessa was being called nigger, and I'd bring it up at the staff meeting, and this guy would just say, well, if Vanessa's being called a nigger, she probably deserved it. She must have kicked somebody in the nuts. Does anybody on my staff object to this? You know, this is what I talk about a lot, is people need to recognize the dignity of everybody. But my staff, and even some of those teachers, many of them were very good friends of mine, but they didn't want to, you know, upset Mr. White, which was his name. Teacher on the staff never wanted to have special ed kids in his class, because that means you have to have a white nigger in your class. I said, well, what do you mean by a white nigger? Well, you know, somebody, any of the SEAs is what we really call them, education assistants, but his term for them was, you know, white niggers. And this guy I've got to teach next door to, you know, and just, you know, principals and teachers, you just endure. And when you've had enough, you pack your bags and you move on to another school. I taught at a school that had a quarter of the population was from the Musqueam Reserve, and it was heartbreaking. I mean, I really had to leave that school, and I loved my kids, and I'm still in contact with a lot of them, but it was, you know, it's like the way the British government was able to take First Nations people and move them over here. Well, you're inconvenient right here, so we're moving you to this piece of land. Well, that's what would happen in school. If the classes weren't evened out, well, let's move these kids back a grade into grade 6 so we can make the classes the same size. I mean, that's called failing people. That's retroactively failing them. You know, that was the straw that broke the camel's back at that school. I mean, I finished out the year, and yes, I was happy. The principal knew that I would welcome these kids because I loved them. I'd taught them before, but I was really angry and confronted the staff with the fact they deserved to be in a grade 7 class. Well, that class is too big. We don't want to have to make split classes. So certainly the staff was not going to stand beside me there, because none of them wanted there to be any split classes in the school. So, you know, you look for the First Nations people whom you're just used to moving around and telling them where they can be. And, you know, sometimes I'd have student teachers who were really inappropriate. And I thought UBC should fail some of these people. You know, I don't want to call any Jew lady. I mean, imagine somebody saying that, and he's going to be standing in a classroom, you know. But UBC didn't want him to fail. He dropped out, and so he could start again the next fall, you know. But it's it's an ongoing thing. I couldn't even begin to list the hundreds of incidents and the stupid stories that are written about people of color in a lot of the school readers, you know, really inappropriate stuff. A little girl has got to run and show that her moccasins are fast before she's entitled to have the dignity of being a person who can be accepted. No. And that was the story of our lives. We had to go and run fast, you know, in order to get dignity, you know.
You told me that about a principal. This story is really stuck in my head, about a principal who denied that there was racism in his school when this little black girl was being horribly harassed. Do you remember that story where he said, is this ringing any bells? Where he said,
well, Mr. White was the one who was really angry about the Haitian girl.
and he said, we don't have a problem with racism.
Oh, no, that story is a very recent story. I mean, I've been retired, you know, for more than a decade now. The story I told you about that man, that's a school that's 300 meters from my home here. This little girl is in grade 1 in a Vancouver elementary school, and she was being called nigger, and her father went up to the school and spoke to the principal, and the principal said to him, you know, we didn't have any trouble with racism until you came here.
And this is recent?
This is a year and a half ago. This is the year before COVID. So if we think we're changing anything, I don't know where the change is happening.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask next was, has there been an evolution? Has there been change in the 35 years, over the 35 years that you taught? Did you see things get better or not?
Well, for me, I'm not convinced, because I don't think things can change until people face them. You know, nothing can be changed until we face it and acknowledge that it's there. And I don't think Canadians acknowledge it at all. I think because they've witnessed the murder of George Floyd, one of thousands of men who have been murdered by the police. And since the conviction of the man who killed him, there have been probably a half a dozen more. One guy shot in the back of the head, I don't know, 3 days ago. I mean, people have to acknowledge what exists if things are going to change. And for me, I don't see it. Now, I do know that there are lots of good things happening. I know that I go into a lot of schools in February, and I'm really impressed to see the amount of material that is tacked up in staff rooms on First Nations education. Somebody is preparing and putting into schools some very good materials, but it comes down to the teachers in the classroom who are going to deliver that material, or the principals who encourage their staffs to do this in a respectful way. So
let's go there. Yeah, but let's go there next, because I mean, Lorna has spent much of her career developing these materials and training these teachers.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So Lorna, so you created curricula. You wrote a textbook about you wrote the first. Yeah, what the first one though you wrote was in what, 1984 or something, right? So how was your material received then? And kind of walk us through how that's changed, if it has.
Well, that book, I began that book in 1979.
Okay.
I was invited by Douglas and McIntyre if I would join their writing team, because they were going to develop books for texts for social studies, and they asked me if I would join their development team, and I told Scott, I said I would love to. I said, but I'm not going to write a book for grade 4. I said, if I'm going to do one, I said I'd like to write one on community, and which is grade 2. And the reason why I didn't want, at that time, didn't want to do grade 4 was because that was where we were studied in school.
Oh, yes, yes. I was teaching that too, yes.
But the way that we were always studied was, was shameful. And,
Basket weaving. It was all basket weaving. The whole curriculum. It's what they did in grade 4.
that or striking around looking for food as though we, or helping the settlers. But so I didn't want to do grade 4. And I wrote, I developed a text for grade 2, and I modeled it after a child in my home community, and it took until 1984 to get it published. Why? Because the province didn't want it. And they brought Douglas and McIntyre to court. There was that. It was over their agreement because they didn't want my book. And finally, Scott asked me to come and see him, Scott McIntyre, and he said, "Lorna, I'm going to lose our company, because we can't win this fight." And he said, I'm prepared to publish it as a trade book, but we'll have to remove it from the series. And so I said, no, I don't think so. If that's what, if it can't be part of the series, I said, I'd prefer that it wasn't part of, it wasn't published. Anyway, that night I met with a group of, with some people, some friends, educators, and some of them were going to the ministry the next day. And so I was telling them the story about my book. Anyway, they went to the meeting, and rather than talk about what it was they were supposed to, they brought this up, with the people in the ministry. And about, how, what a big mistake it was. Anyway, after that meeting, things changed, and the ministry decided that they would allow the book. There were 4 community books. They would allow the book, but they would leave it up to the teachers to choose
whether to do it or not. Yeah.
Which they could, they could teach, I can't remember, it was 2 or 3 of the books. So so the teachers were able to choose themselves. So it was published, and then the Vancouver Sun did a 2-page spread, and the lead line at that time was, like on the front page was a picture of the cover of my book, and it said, "A rosy-eyed look at an Indian reserve." And then in the 2 pages in the middle of the newspaper, they interviewed people from every position, like the president of BCT Teachers Federation, the principals, everybody, including people in my community. Everybody condemned my book. And but one of the things that the Vancouver Sun did was it took some of the photographs of my book, and which was, children happy, eating salmon and being with their grandparents, doing things on the land, doing things in their community. And then put that, and then alongside it, they put photographs from my community of children standing in front of a house that had icicles coming from the roof. And these children were standing there, yes, eating the same dried salmon, but they didn't, it was winter, and they had no coat on. They had no shoes. but they were smiling, so they were saying, which one is true, they said. And then they asked, like, why is there nothing in this book about the high alcoholism, the high unemployment, the high incarceration, the high infant mortality? And this is grade 2.
Yeah, right.
And so it was interesting because to experience this, I was really upset, of course. I had just started my job at the Vancouver School Board. And so then this came out. And I remember I was crying. I was really upset. And I phoned my brother because it was his daughter who was the model in my book.
Oh.
And I was telling him about it, because I didn't want him to read it. And so I was telling him about this article, and I could hear her in the background because she was very curious. This little, at this time she was 9 years old, and she was saying, "What is it?" I could hear her saying, "What is it, Daddy? What is it? Are they talking about the book?" And so then he said to me, "Just wait," he said. And so I could hear him explaining to her what this newspaper article was saying. And she said, "Oh, Daddy," she said, "are they saying we're not real?" And so, I wiped my tears, and she, because she hit it right on.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then it was interesting because I was invited to speak to teachers, and they were so conflicted and afraid. So this is what all these people are saying about this text, and so what am I supposed to do? And there was such fear and confusion amongst the teachers, and so it made it very difficult for them to choose to use the book. But at the same time, teachers who did have the courage and the foresight to use this book, I received letters from grade 2 children, and who told me, "I do this just like the girl in the book. We do it differently, my grandma and grandpa and I, but we do these things." And so I realized how important it was that that we work on getting our stories into the school system, so that children could see themselves in a positive way and to connect with others. And yeah, that was very, very difficult. And
it continued to be difficult because you went on to design a curriculum for teachers, right, to use in the schools about Indigenous language and culture. And I think you told me that many teachers refused to use it initially. Was that right?
Yeah, and it was because of this, and it's because of this fear. And there was Canadians know nothing about Indigenous people, and unless they study it on their own and search on their own. And so I would say that's been one of the greatest barriers, is our teachers not wanting to face their ignorance, and also their fear to not say or do the right thing, and they don't know what the right thing is. And and that's why when I got to the University of Victoria, I said that one of the things that I would do is to have a mandatory course on Indigenous education, so teachers would be prepared before they became teachers.
Mm.
And and that was just in this century. It took that, so it takes a long time to shift and change institutions.
And has there been a shift and a change?
Somewhat, you know, when it was decided that that requirement of having a mandatory course in Indigenous education for all teacher education programs, there was a real pushback from some universities who didn't want to. They said, you can't tell us what to do, and we're already doing something. And but because of many things, there have been people who've, Indigenous people who've been advocating in this province and across the country for so long, and they've made a huge difference. I can see this, in my lifetime.
Yeah. So before we go to the questions, because I think there are a few, I just want to sort of get your measure of where things stand today. What does racism look like in your day-to-day lives now?
I'll jump in here. I am sick to death of being asked where I'm from. People see people of color, even First Nations people who've been here for 30,000 years, and they'll say to them, "Where are you from?" And they don't mean, are you from a Hausa or Lilwat? No, they think if you've got brown skin, you're not Canadian. They don't ask that of white European. I mean, I have friends who should be called Swedish Canadian because I'm always called a Black Canadian. My friend Faye Wong's family came here to build the railway. They're long-time Canadians. People don't call Faye Canadian, they call her Chinese. And I would like to think that every time you see somebody who isn't white, that you will one day stop assuming that we're from someplace else. I find that really surprising. The other thing that I still continue to see is that people, they're not prepared to risk their own, I don't know, whatever, to stand beside somebody who you can see is either being insulted or humiliated or treated badly in a store or whatever. People are very, I would like to see things that surprise me and delight me when I see a racist thing happening, whether it's happening to me or to somebody else on the street. When I'm abused on the bus, I would like to hear somebody on that bus say, that's inappropriate.
Are you abused on the bus?
I've been abused on the bus, not in the past 6 months, or the past year. I haven't ridden the bus very much since COVID, but yeah. You get called names all the time, and it's wearing. You go into department stores and they want to send you oh, you probably shouldn't be shopping here. Things are less expensive if you go up one floor. You really shouldn't. I'm tired of all of that. I'm really tired of it.
Wow.
And yes, you can call them micro whatever. I'm insulted. I don't divide it into micro and macro. It's all racism as far as I'm concerned, and it's wearing. And Canadians who are white need to shape up and stop assuming that everybody who's not the same color as them is not a Canadian.
I hear you, Lorna. I mean, you told me a story about, if we're going to talk about systemic racism, and one of the topics that we touched on earlier was in our previous conversation was healthcare, and you told me the story about your dad.
Well, I think a big change is, one of the big changes is that there are reports and that have been put out in the last little while.
Yeah.
And I think I was telling you that that one of the reports was Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafon's report,
Yes.
In Plain Sight. And I tell people that's real necessary reading for everybody.
Yeah.
Because I think she did a great job. And I must have been telling you that I contributed to, to that report because my father and my brother were both abused by the medical system, and my father died because of his treatment. And I was able to finally, in a few years, just in the last few years, I was able to tell, in 2017 or 2018, I was able to finally tell his story and my brother's story. And we weren't able to tell those stories when they happened. And anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, all righty. So now I think there's quite a few questions that have piled up. So at this very poignant moment, do you mind if we take a few questions?
Sounds good.
Okay. So let's see now. Some of these questions we will deal with in the second part because they're more prescriptive. What can we do, kind of thing. What is this? I'm not sure I understand that one. Okay.
There's this one in the chat about
Valerie.
the
Yeah, Valerie, did you report your racist principal?
Who would I report it to?
I don't know, the school board?
Well, okay, we'll take the situation at Southland School where these children had been moved to a different grade. I took it to the staff. The principal at the school at the time was the head of the Principals Association, and I couldn't even get a job after that. I ended up taking a year out of school. Out of teaching. Mr. Harper in my first year of teaching, who was going to strap, the little darky over there. I was a brand new teacher. I was on probation. This man at age whatever he was, 63, ready for retirement. They aren't going to, I never have any expectation. When Mr. White, who was really so openly racist and the staff would sit silently, the school board already knew how bad he was because he didn't even let the area counselor come into the school. This was a South Asian man who was assigned to come into our school in September. He didn't get in the door until March. And the area superintendent just stayed away from our school because it was so toxic. It was so bad. And the school board, they will always support these old principals because to buy them out or to have a case brought against them, I'm not dumb. I know how much power I have in the system. Yeah. So no, the school board knew probably about all of those instances. I don't think they knew about when I first went to Krishna School on the west side and the kids were moving up, wanting to move out of my classroom. The kids I thought liked me, but their parents didn't necessarily want their children to have this. And the school board went along with having people moved out, and there's nothing you can do. I feel terribly powerless within the education system. So no, there's nothing that the school board did in any instance. Yeah.
And yet for 35 years, you endured that.
Well, I think the longest I stayed anywhere was 9 years, 10 years, I guess. So, I'd spend 5 years at school. And sometimes, you stick it out because the kids are so great. And, if you're busy enough and you do what you love doing, and I have to say, I really enjoyed teaching. I did a lot of extracurricular things. I took my kids to Victoria every year. We went presented the hearings on saving the endowment lands and getting Pacific Spirit Park. I mean, we really engaged the community. I really enjoyed it. I loved the teaching. So it's like, I don't quit life. I run into racism all the time. There's nobody to report all that to. So you do the part that you really love. Anyway, next question.
Jonathan? Oh,
Sorry, who was that? Did someone say something?
Got another
Okay.
question?
Valerie, there's another question for you here. If this happened today, do you think the result might be different?
Well, I don't think it's any different for this little grade 1 girl who goes to a school that's at just 15th Avenue, just west of Oak Street. I don't think anything has changed there. We think things have changed because we have Pink Shirt Day and we have Black Shirt Day, but you don't teach anti-racism by one day of wearing a black shirt or 1 month of whatever. I don't know that, I haven't seen anything to convince me that things are different now. I don't know that that principal has been censured. I sent the father of that little grade 1 girl who was being called nigger, and the principal had said, only happening because you're here. I sent him to the school board. I don't think it made any difference. So I'm not as positive as I should be. So.
Well, there was an item on the news on April 21st, just a couple of days ago in Edmonton, about a 14-year-old black boy who was severely beaten in the playground by a group of white boys, calling him the N-word, and he had to be hospitalized. That was on CBC News. And I guess that the worst part about it was that the school and the police both said, oh, well, we'll take care of it, in terms of the attackers. There was no transparency about what punishment the gang of boys would have to face. So it's, yeah. Lorna, is this racism is something that, it's hard to believe that you would, at this, with your stature, that you would still encounter, but do you?
Yeah,
In the day-to-day? Every day?
Yeah, it's, in some form, or another. It's something that, in this country, if you are Indigenous, you learn to live with it.
Yeah. Well, Lorna, there's a question for you here. What is the significance of the numbers in Indigenous names? Like there's a 7 in yours, right?
Yeah, it's the numbers, and it's usually just the 7. It's not there. You don't really see any other. And I have to admit that I was participant in this in the use of the 7 in our names. The 7, when you see it, refers to is a glottal stop. So in First Nations languages, some of them, not all, there are glottal stops, and these are, in Indigenous languages the world over. And in the International Phonetics Alphabet, a glottal stop symbol is an unfinished question mark. And so when we were developing our writing system in Mount Currie in the early 70s, we either had to saw off part of the question mark in order to be able to use a typewriter, or so we decided that we would use a 7, and we also didn't want to use a question mark, because then that would just be that would also be confusing. And so we decided that because of the typewriter that we had available to us, we would use a 7.
Okay, so you have to say your name now with the glottal stop, because we can understand. Pardon?
So you just cut off the air on the last sound.
Do it one more time.
Wenosa.
Okay. Okay, Lucille, there you go. Okay. If there aren't any more questions on this segment, then I'd because it is 6:30 already, I'd like to move along to part 2, which is sort of the wider themes about what needs to change. What kind of society do we want to live in, and how can we live together? So Lauren has already pointed out the racism in healthcare report by Judge Mary Ellen Turpel-Lafont in plain sight that came out in November. 84% of Indigenous people who reported said that they had experienced some form of discrimination in healthcare in BC. Some of them grievously so, like Lorna's father. And more than half of Indigenous healthcare workers reported they had personally experienced racism at work. The report had 11 key findings and 24 recommendations. And then more recently, in terms of proactive, the federal government announced in February a $221 million over 4 years Black entrepreneurship program to help grow and promote Black-owned businesses. So I'd really like to hear your thoughts on, are we moving forward? Is this progress? And if not, what needs to be done? Who wants to start? Laura?
Well, I'm always very hopeful with children. I think that's why I remained a teacher. I had no interest in administration. I think that for the most part, you know, children are quite positive about each other until they hear enough stories from their parents, or they sitting in their car and listening to their parents as they drive, you know, making comments about people who don't look like them. I think that I think youth has got a lot of potential. I think right now there are a lot of initiatives coming from young Black people, young Indigenous people. I would love to see more leadership opportunities being given to young people. I think older people, even people whom I dearly love, will refer to their friends as my Japanese friend, somebody who's been, you know, 3 generations in Canada. But you listen to young people, and number one, you see a great number of interracial relationships around young people. In my day, when I was married, I mean, there were still so many places that didn't even allow interracial marriage, and people didn't. You look now at people coming down the street, I just feel we need to turn a lot of things over to the youth. I think they have a lot to offer. They're not blinded by perhaps the education they got in the school system, which was only about the English world. And I think promoting youth is a place to start. I might be naive there, but I feel more hopeful with them than I do with older people. Yeah. For me, that would be really good if we put more power into the hands of young people who are not as conditioned.
So Lorna, I mean, we've had the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, we've had the Missing and Murdered Women Commission, we have this new health care report. I mean, what would you say? Are things changing for Indigenous peoples at all? Are we on the right track?
The big change is that that at least Canadians finally, you know, I mean, probably not across the board, but at least some Canadians are aware of these reports. We're talking, you know, we've mentioned one of them or a couple of them just now, and to this circle. There was, for example, the Royal Commission. That was an amazing, incredible work, and very few Canadians even knew about it.
Yeah.
And so that's, so I'd say that's a big step. And yesterday I read a report that was put out by the Psychological Association, the Canadian Psychology Association, in which they owned, and they made a statement about the harm they've caused. And for an organization like that to very publicly say we caused harm, I think is a big step.
That's what I call facing it. I think if we face our errors, face our racism, we can change. We can make it's the denial or the failure to face things that is my biggest concern with so many people. They haven't acknowledged. And as you say, that's a powerful step when people acknowledge that they've been on the wrong path.
Yeah.
So what about unconscious bias? Because I think that, in my opinion, I think that is a really big factor in racism in Canada and probably in a lot of countries.
So give me an example of what you mean by unconscious racism.
Well, I mean, if you're being consciously racist, you're doing it.
Yes, yeah.
But if you have 10 people applying for a job and 2 of them are Black or Indigenous, and then you may in some way say to yourself, well, they probably won't fit in very well. They're culturally, so I'm not gonna interview them. You just kind of skim over them. You're not saying it's because I don't like Black people or I don't like First Nations people. You're just saying they're probably not the right fit.
But you know what is happening, what I find really interesting since George Floyd was murdered before our eyes, is that suddenly in Vancouver, I don't know about the rest of this country, but I'm seeing an awful lot of Black people in ads, and I'm staggered. That means some people are beginning to see us as something other than freaks, that we are actually there. I mean, advertising has been a very powerful tool of keeping this country anglicized. Every image was somebody white in every ad, in every movie. And if there were a Black person in a movie, they were the servant. So people have been conditioned with that. When people, somebody made a movie quite a while ago, I think it was Chris Rock, and it was about bad hair. And it showed these people going for a job interview. Now, the person with the PhD and the best job experience wore her hair deliberately in an afro. She was the first person cut from the shortlisting because this was repellent to the potential employer. And I think, nowadays people are maybe thinking, well, maybe you aren't so totally stupid if you have an afro, because we're actually seeing people in advertising. I don't know how long this is going to last. I'm never very hopeful, but it would be nice to have people look at somebody of color and not make a generalization. Oh, that person's First Nations or Indian or whatever, and they probably, will be late for work. That's what a lot of people do. So I'm not going to hire her.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm sort of hoping that we're going to get past a lot of that. If you present people, if there are more people recognizing and seeing us not as freaks or lazy or stupid, which is what we're always considered, thieves. Even in my apartment building, there's a woman in here who thinks I'm going to rob her all the time. It's terrifying to me. But anyway, so we're either stupid or we're criminal in some way. I mean, my friend Leon Bibb was arrested for wearing a hat at Kitsilano Beach,
Leon Bibb, the singer, the
artist.
Yes,
because they thought he was a pimp. And within weeks of the police doing that, they did it again to a provincial court justice, Valman Romilly. He wore a hat, and he just let the police arrest him and take him downtown. And then when they finally bothered to look at his ID and could see that, in fact, he was a provincial court judge, they let him go. They supposedly had apologized after doing it to Leon, but they didn't make any change in their behaviors. So all I'm saying is they've looked at Black people with sort of they think they know who we are, just like people think they know who First Nations people are, when, as Lorna says, they won't even sort of read the course material and find out who we are, So yeah, that you might call that unconscious racism. I call it conscious racism.
That's
When you look
conscious.
at a group of people and you've decided you're not
Yeah.
going to hire that person with very brown skin, you've already got some ideas in your mind as to who this person is. You know, stupid, criminal, lazy, who knows? But certainly not somebody you want to employ.
Yeah. Lorna, you're looking extremely thoughtful. What, you know, this is the people who are watching this, who are listening, are people who really want to know. You know, they're leaders, they're employers. What can our women, what do they need to know? And how can we, what do we need to look for in ourselves?
Well, I would just say that what I ask everybody, including myself, is to have the courage to look inside you, and and what and how you treat people and think about people, and because it's so normalized in this country to think of people who are other in a particular way, and and so the more we can have stories to really learn and appreciate each other, it's to have those opportunities, it makes a huge difference. And and everybody wants to be seen, and so we can do that for each other. That's a big step, no matter who you are.
You know, I was thinking recently about, looking at a newspaper that comes, and there are sections of the newspaper that I just turn the page past. I don't play bridge, so I wouldn't ever even look at that column that's about bridge, or I go right past the comics or whatever. And what I feel that people do with people like me, we're sort of like the thing they're not interested in. It's sort of like, turning the pages and looking for people that are like themselves. And I would like to challenge people to take the time to look at other people who don't look like you, or are not, or you think they're not like you. They're probably a lot more like you than you would imagine. I would, instead of, passing by, moving on to the familiar, which is what I would do if I were reading a newspaper. I sort of think that's how some people look at the people in our community. They don't give everybody the same attention to the same degree.
There's a lovely question here from one of our members, Nancy Lawton. And she says, I find my grandchildren are so open and welcoming to everyone. How do we keep that alive in them?
Yeah, it would be wonderful to keep it alive. That's why I say, I think, we have to look to youth. I think some of us are older people. I don't know how we keep it alive, but we have to celebrate it. We have to celebrate that.
Lorna, do you have any thoughts?
Well, you keep it alive by living that way, and acknowledging when people are being unkind, to be able to have the strength to use your voice.
Stand up, be an Annabelle.
Yeah.
Be an animal. Stand up, speak out. When we see something, speak out.
Yeah.
As an organization, I mean, IWF is a big organization. We have chapters and forum around the world. What can we as women do in this organization to make a difference? That's a question from Carol.
Apparently,
Are you asking your women in the organization? Are
I'm
they
asking you.
Oh, you're asking us. Oh,
Yeah.
what can you
What,
do?
I mean, because you've got, you've got an audience here, what would,
Okay, yeah, you can stay open. You can dare to be, try something new. Don't, try to be a little bit more adventurous and look to a person that you might have 6 months ago, you might have passed that person by as not being the appropriate person for that position. Try to be a little bit more daring and foster them. Lorna used that word today, and I think that's a word that we all need to do. We need to foster the strengths of other people and support them and welcome them into your group. I think that's, it might be a little bit of work for you, but I think there are benefits there to enlarging your own world. And, it enlarges everybody's life, not just the person that you've hired and might have to give a bit of extra support to, but it'll enlarge you as well. Yeah, and to foster
great
other people.
idea. Yeah.
Well, be conscious about walking your path of equity, and and model it as an organization. And because if you're not modeling it and you say that's what you're doing, then you have to question really your organization.
Mhm. Yeah, look at who your members are, see who's there, see who you're not bringing in, and see who, you could do a bit of a stretch and be more inclusive. It's, yeah.
So start within ourselves. Yeah.
Yep.
Good. Lorna, there's a question for you about, can you recommend some books for us to read?
Lots, but I can't.
Maybe you could send me a list and I will send them out.
That would
Okay.
be
Now, one person, Michelle, has recommended Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility.
Yeah, I agree.
Is that a good one?
Yeah, it's good. It's good. I much prefer Mr. Coates, Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, and he's talking to his son. And I think it would give the reader a wonderful insight into how people of another color are facing each day, what's going on inside their minds, so that you might then get an opportunity or see yourself in some way as to how you can alleviate some of this stress that people of color carry with them, and you probably don't even know that they're carrying it. But that's a very powerful book. I know that these books that are out right now, like White Fragility, are really good. I listened to the author of that. She's got a podcast on, it's on YouTube, I think, and somebody else is talking about intersectionality. I can't remember what that book is called, but yes, there are some good books out there that are helpful. But for me, yeah, you can read a lot and not necessarily be aware of whether or not you're actually incorporating.
So just the title of Ta-Nehisi Coates' book is Between the World and Me, is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Mhm.
We'll take a note on that. All right, on a positive note, this is one Nancy's saying, we have 176 members registered for a West Coast and Caribbean Zoom get-together. IWF gives us so many opportunities to meet women with diverse backgrounds and experiences. So just a comment.
Mm. Great.
Yeah, and Karina LeBlanc, who I'm sure whose name you know, an Olympian. Thank you for this honest discussion. We all play an important role in this, and we all need to own our parts and make sure we take actions towards it being better. So, well, if there's no more questions, then I think we can wrap up. Do you have any final words of wisdom for us, either of you, or?
No, I think love is at the bottom of it all. If you love yourself, maybe you'll be able to love other people, and at least consider loving other people. I do think there is good that resides in all of us, and yeah.
That's amazing that you can say that after all the stories you've told us. That's
Oh, well,
that's
I have hundreds
a
and
big
hundreds
part.
of absolutely wonderful, wonderful friends. And, you know, they're not all on the same page in terms of race, but they're all working to do their bit. And many people I've known, like little Annabelle since grade 2. And, you know, we're all on a journey. None of us are perfect, you know.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and I just want to say thank you to all of you
Being interested.
for being part of this, and thank you to the organizers and you know, for inviting me to be a part of it, and Patricia, thanks for all that you've done to get us ready, and you know, for
I didn't have to do anything. I mean,
being the moderator.
it's been a great honor. It's been a great honor, and thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedules.
Well, thank you. I echo the words of Lorna. Thank you.
On behalf of IWFBC, I want to express our group gratitude to both Lorna and Valerie for sharing these very personal stories. Hard to hear, but need to be heard. I'm sure I'm not the only one that teared up a few times. Patricia, thank you for your sensitive and professional moderating, and Patricia and Anne both for doggedly pursuing this topic. We have a long way to go, and we must always be Annabelles. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night. Thank you.
Bonsoir. Thank you very much. Very touching and inspiring, and tough to listen to those testimonies, but I will read between the word and me.
Oh, great.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.